Next week, Democratic presidential candidates will take the stage again for the second round of primary debates. This comes as former Vice President and frontrunner Joe Biden says he will hit back at opponents this time around and will be less polite to Senator Kamala Harris at this next debate. Our Ed O'Keefe reports on another disagreement between Biden and Senators Kamala Harris and Cory Booker that centers around race.
Wall Street did not build this country. Middle-class people and access to the middle class build it.
Former Vice President Joe Biden and other Democrats appeared this week at conferences hosted by civil rights organizations, touting their plans to revamp the criminal justice system. But Biden also took time to defend his record on civil rights, in part by referencing President Obama.
They did a significant background check on me for months with 10 people. I doubt whether he would have picked me if there's accusations about my being wrong on civil rights was correct.
Biden's lead over the Democratic field has slipped since the first debates.
Do you agree today that you were wrong to oppose busing in America?
This week, Biden was asked about a CBS News poll that identified California Senator Kamala Harris as the most strong candidate among Democratic voters.
I was probably overly polite.
In a radio interview Thursday, he also raised questions about Harris's motives at the first debate.
I thought we were friends, and I hope we still will be. You know, she asked me to go to her convention and be the guy from outside of California to nominate her at her convention for the Senate seat. I did.
Biden, Harris, and New Jersey Senator Cory Booker will be front and center at a debate next Wednesday. Booker is raising doubts about Biden's new plan to revamp federal sentencing laws and drug policy, since the former VP backed tough-on-crime bills in the 1990s.
For a guy who helped to be an architect of mass incarceration, this is an inadequate solution.
But Biden hit back, raising questions about Booker's past record as mayor of Newark, New Jersey.
His police department was stopping and frisking people, mostly African-American men. If he wants to go back and talk about records, I'm happy to do that, but I'd rather talk about the future.
All right, so Ed O'Keefe is joining us now from Washington. Ed, why did Biden change his stance? Did he take a second look at his performance during the last debate and think, that didn't quite go well?
Yeah, I mean, he had sort of come out of that and had maintained throughout that he was going to try to be sort of a welcoming and accepting and sort of broad-based frontrunner. But I think in the last few days has realized that he's got to at least telegraph in advance that he's prepared to, you know, kind of rough it up a little bit if his rivals do try to come at him again on the debate stage. And quite frankly, you could argue that their attempts to rough him up last time didn't really work. While the numbers may have tightened a little bit, he has this just incredibly sustained support, not only in the early primary states, but in other hypothetical matchups, and really nobody yet has been able to catch him in any real strong sense. We're only one debate through this cycle. There's at least 12 scheduled. We've got a long way to go. But early indications are that he's just holding on to a pretty firm grip over this entire field.
So let's talk about some of the most recent polls that reflect what you just said. CBS News Battleground Tracker poll out this week gives Biden a double-digit lead over his rivals in an early primary state, South Carolina. And the thinking is that this is primarily driven by his support within the African-American community. How important is that, particularly because we're talking about South Carolina?
In South Carolina, it's critical because in 2016, they accounted for about 6 in 10 Democratic primary voters. And they are a primarily older and more moderate block of Democratic primary voters, the African-American voters in that state. So Biden knows that. He's like, perfect. Those are my people. Not only have they been supporters of mine through the years, but working with President Obama has helped, and our politics are similar. They are not liberal, people who might be in favor of some of the proposals being pushed by a lot of his younger rivals. They are more middle of the road. They are older. And so he believes if he sort of keeps doing what he's been doing, that at least in South Carolina he'll be fine. Of course, South Carolina comes fourth after Iowa, after New Hampshire, after Nevada, and so, right around Nevada. So, we'll see how he does in those first few contests. But his team certainly sees South Carolina as a firewall. And it's part of why Booker and Harris are doing this, because, of course, they are African-American, and their numbers of support among black voters are still quite minuscule, frankly, not only in South Carolina, but across the country. And so I think what they're trying to do here, what their teams would admit they're trying to do, is sort of say to black voters across the country, wait a second, think about this. He's been part of the systemic problem. He spent 40 years in the Senate, 8 years as vice president. Did they really do enough to help us over the course of that? That was what Booker was talking about yesterday at the Urban League meetings in Indianapolis, that you can bring out a flashy new plan that would revamp the criminal justice system, but if you were the one to help build the current system with the tough on crime laws of the 80s and the 90s, and now you want to reverse all that, then why are you really doing that? And so it'll be interesting to see how that argument plays out. And it speaks to a broader problem, Anne-Marie, that the party is still grappling with. Do you go back to Wisconsin, Iowa, and Pennsylvania and try to win over those distressed, middle-class, blue-collar white voters, like the kinds you find in books like Hillbilly Elegy? Or do you go back to Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, maybe Ohio, and try to run up the score among urban voters and immediate suburban voters who are more likely to be younger, more liberal, and minorities? And that is a fight that the party will continue to have in the coming months. And this argument between Biden and Booker speaks to that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And you mentioned something else, that in pretty much every poll, but we have a new one from Quinnipiac University, Biden going head-to-head against Trump, he beats him. And so the latest one from Quinnipiac puts him head-to-head against Trump in Ohio, and he beats him there. How do you think the two campaigns are going to kind of use this information?
Well, let's go back 4 years. And similar surveys would have had Hillary Clinton clocking the president. So, you don't read these polls with too much authority. As I've said before on the stream here, an early poll of a presidential contest more than a year away is about as reliable as a napkin as an umbrella in a rainstorm. It's not worth it. But it is indicative, perhaps more than anything, about a potential concern about the president's performance in these critical states. But you're right. Week after week, we're seeing something from Pennsylvania, Texas, now Ohio, that suggests that the president is in trouble. His team knows that. They're working on it. And he has still a pretty narrow path to victory that requires essentially doing just as well as he did in all the states he won last time, with very little room for error.
So let's go back to Kamala Harris. You talked about the support that Biden has been receiving amongst older African Americans. But, that's something that's a little bit different now, I think, as we're looking at the Democratic voters, particularly within the African American community, is what older African Americans, what sort of wins them over is not necessarily what might win over younger African-American voters.
Totally.
And I think that's what these candidates are sort of zoning in on. So Senator Kamala Harris is rolling out 2 new plans this morning in what her campaign calls her Black agenda. What do we know about that?
Right, and this actually speaks to 2 broader things she's trying to do: increase teacher pay and improve or bolster economic empowerment for Black Americans, Latinos, and Asians across the country. She'll be at the Urban League meetings in Indianapolis today and plans to unveil a $60 billion plan for historically Black colleges and universities, and about another $2.5 billion to train professors and teachers at those HBCUs. Also has a plan that would provide essentially $12 billion in direct investment to Black entrepreneurs, essentially through government contracting. That's actually been a long-standing concern, that when it comes to government contracts, frankly, when it comes to contracting in the Democratic Party, that minority-owned businesses or minorities don't necessarily get a seat at the table. She has unveiled similar plans in the past. A lot of ideas like this have been introduced just this week, because not only was the National Urban League holding their meetings, but the NAACP had their convention in Detroit. As you look at the calendar, various interest groups that have some influence over the democratic process, the uppercase democratic process, you see candidates unveiling policy ideas related to those groups. So this week, it's been criminal justice, and in the case of Senator Harris, Black empowerment, because those are obviously Black economic empowerment, because those are obviously big concerns to Black voters.
All right, so let's look at next week's debates. I, for one, when I was sort of looking at the matchups, it seems like whoever ended up on night 2 lucked out, because you've got Biden, Booker, and Kamala Harris, so you know there's going to be fireworks. Plus, it's night 2, and if we've learned anything from the last debates, is no matter what your performance is like on night 1, everyone remembers what happened on night 2. But this is not about entertainment. It's about getting to know these candidates. So what will you be watching for? What should we be watching for?
Well, and not to do CNN's bidding here because they're the ones hosting this thing, but I actually think night one could be quite interesting because the headliners there are Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, the two sort of New England progressives who have arguably had more of an influence over the policy debate in this primary than anybody else. But they'll be joined on stage by a cast of lesser-known moderates who are likely to try to score points by sort of raising red flags about some of the ideas these two are pushing, especially, for example, government-backed health care plans like Medicare for All. So I suspect that Tuesday night could be a far more intellectual exchange between wings of the party, liberals and moderates arguing over what exactly the party should be focused on, while Wednesday night promises to be a bit dramatic because you're right, you'll have a Biden-Harris rematch, and you'll have Senator Booker there as well, who has been trying with all his might to raise some questions about the former vice president, but has seen very little bounce in support for doing so.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I know he's sort of like the third person in the conversation trying to jump in on essentially some of the same issues that Kamala Harris has brought up.
Right.
Ed O'Keefe, always love your analysis. Thank you very much.
Have a good weekend, Emery.
You too.